From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Here's today's lineup. K-State's Dan O'Brien will talk about some out-of-the-ordinary basis trends currently found at certain Kansas elevators during Dan's weekly segment on the grain markets. Then K-State's Mike Stamm will talk about achieving good canola stand establishment at planting time, including a look at what new K-State research is saying about optimum canola seeding rates. Later, from the IGP Institute at K-State, Jay O'Neill talks about a couple of container grain marketing workshops the Institute hosted this week for producers and marketers interested in selling grain via smaller volume containers. And on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp will be with us here on Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Well, in search of inspiration, the otherwise slow-going grain markets now are looking to the USDA's updated crop production and grain stocks reports out this coming Tuesday, September the 12th. We will take that up, obviously, along with many more market matters as we talk once again with Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien. Before we get into that USDA suite of reports, let's take a close look at what's happening weather-wise. It is dry in segments of the Corn Belt, and the market is taking some note of that.
Yes, if you look at the rainfall maps for the last 60 days all over the U.S., you see some areas that caught some rain, some that are just moderately dry, etc. Of course, the Pacific Northwest and California coast stands out, as well as the Texas Gulf Coast with a high amount of rainfall that came from the recent hurricane and tropical storm down there. So if you take a longer-term view, the 60-day percent of normal precipitation doesn't look too bad in parts of the Corn Belt. But if you kind of re-ratchet your attention to the last 2 weeks, you see basically the rainfall that came from the Gulf Coast weather event didn't spread out over the whole Corn Belt. And I remember, Eric, last week as we were talking about this, we were quoting Weather Service reports and actually USDA reports saying, gosh, if rainfall doesn't come from that, we're going to start to see some dry areas show up in Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Iowa. And that's what's happened. Again, the rainfall from that Gulf Coast event kind of shot up through the Ohio River Valley, heading up towards the Corn Belt, but never really got into those main production areas by and large. So we've got, over the last 2 weeks, we've had about 5 or 10% of normal rainfall all throughout Illinois, Indiana, on into parts of Ohio. Of course, Iowa had been challenged before, and here it's dry. So, of course, pollination, long done. We're at the place now of late season, ear fill, and quote, finishing out the crop. And here we have some pretty challenging conditions to deal with. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're coming into this report, and it doesn't take much to brush off the painful memories of many folks that were thinking the USDA would come out in the August report and come in with a yield figure of 163 to 168 or something like that.
Right. The trade reacted not timidly to that.
It was not a nice collegial response.
No.
But anyway, so it came in at 169.5. Well, now we have groups coming in again, scratching their heads, thinking, "Gosh, where is this thing going to go?" You do see some very respectable analysts coming closer to 166, 167 again, citing the dry conditions that we just talked about. We kind of have this foregone opinion towards the Dakotas. We know that they're dry, that they'll be challenged, but really the question is, what do you see in Iowa? What do we see crop losses in Illinois? Do we have poor ear fill off in these areas of Indiana? that don't look so hot relative to what people have been seeing on the ground in some of their tours. So in times like this, when the consensus is that, gosh, we didn't see a problem in that last report, and i.e. we have the anticipation that we'll have something similar to that type of outcome in this report. You almost have a two-sided question. You ask and I think we're kind of doomed to have that until we get into the fields and actually cut this crop and see what our yields are. You wonder, what will the USDA numbers say at this time, given the very disciplined approach they take, which they have to take in considering what's right in front of them, as opposed to what will the numbers be in the October and November reports when we actually have harvest.
Actually, those may carry more clout in the end.
Well, they may. And here we have a corn market and a soybean market, frankly, but especially a corn market, feed grain markets overall, that kind of, I wouldn't say thrown off, but sort of forestalled or lost hope for, if you were a bull, lost hope for crop damage showing up given what they'd seen in field conditions. So you've got a market that is vulnerable to a surprise. We were pretty tepid, pretty worried about, or holding out a lot of hope that there'd be a downward adjustment, a significant downward adjustment in yield and overall crop production and supplies, and really not expecting anything to show up in this report. Well, if you do get something that shows up, then you're more likely to have a move to the higher side. So, interesting. I would say that if I can add to that for these WASDE reports, as we finished up the export marketing year, August 31st for corn, grain sorghum, and soybeans, we ended up ahead of the pace the USDA projected for the feed grains for both corn and grain sorghum. And to me, that's kind of a surprise. Up until the very end, we were kind of trailing. Mm-hmm. Then suddenly there are these numbers. And given the numbers released literally on Monday of this week, it shows that we're 15, 20 million bushels ahead of the USDA's projections by the time we actually got shipments in to match the end of that marketing year. So that will be a positive. Not a huge issue. We're worried about hundreds of millions of bushels and not 10 and 15, but still, it's positive that we have had a decent export pace for the feed grains. And also, we've got about the same change from the USDA's projection on the other side with regard to soybeans. Again, USDA projected about 2.15 billion bushels. It looks like the marketing year actual shipments came in at about 2.12. So, again, about 30 million bushels short. But the big issue is, again, hundreds of millions and that USDA projection of 4.3 billion bushels plus for the size of the crop that'll really move the market. So what happens on the demand side in terms of adjustments, of course, is important, but not near as important for this report in the next couple, 2, 3, as those big production numbers.
Yeah. For the record, that report, again, comes out this coming Tuesday, the 12th, at 11 o'clock in the morning, and we'll be reflecting on that when Dan joins us next week right here. In your weekly notes on the markets, Dan, you have some numbers on local basis levels at the Kansas delivery points, and we generally see wide basis across the board with some interesting twists here and there, you say.
Yes. It is interesting to see, with regard to wheat basis, how basis bids in western Kansas at places like Sept, Syracuse, Ulysses are narrower at this point in time based on the Deese hard red winter wheat contract than in our bellwether export primary typical basis leading areas such as Salina and Hutchinson. So we have, again, we're 90 to 99 under Deese in some of those far west locations and are running $1.08, $1.18 under Deese off in, again, Hutchinson, Wichita, Salina, $1 to $1.05. Actually, there's a bid listed in the USDA's Central Kansas Terminal Processor Daily Grain Report that came out yesterday that there's a Great Bend, Kansas bid that's actually at 98 under, and that's for the Central Kansas corridor. That's the best terminal bid listed out there. You do see some better bids heading off towards Topeka and Atchison at 80 and 90 under. And earlier this week, I checked the Kansas City truck bids for wheat, and they're at 50, 60 under, something like that. So anyway, interesting to see our basis bids, and it seems surprising that the western Kansas bids in some of those outstate locations are actually running narrower or stronger, but at least moderately, than what we have in central Kansas.
Any explanation for that, Dan?
Well, I'm struggling to understand. I think we need, I guess, Eric, to be honest, I have wondered about demand pull, again, taking grain by rail from those locations off down to the south and southwest. That could be one issue. I've had other people in the industry talk about how they're concerned about wheat acreage, perhaps seeing a demand response in that area to try to pull wheat out of whatever on-farm storage we'd have into elevators. So there's some combination of those factors, and probably has something to do with both of those, and perhaps the worry that we have that such low wheat prices relative to break-even costs aren't giving a lot of incentive in some of these areas to plant lots and lots of wheat acres in the fall. So that could be playing into it. I would add in just quickly that when you look at the grain sorghum bids in western part of the state, say at a place like Dodge City, you've got corn basis at 20 under and grain sorghum bids in the same town at 75 under decent on a per bushel basis. And again, that's what we've been seeing throughout the winter. You go to central Kansas and look at Salina, and you've got corn basis bids at 50 under, and that equals grain sorghum basis bids in the same town, well, in the same general market. So interesting that grain sorghum basis bids are holding up pretty decently. Well, actually very good relative to corn, at least on the day or so that we're looking at there. So, frankly, in a situation like that, if someone has grain sorghum that they'll be harvesting this fall, they're wondering how to sell it. Well, gosh, to see a basis bid like that, you would wonder about taking out at least a basis contract to take advantage of the narrow basis for grain sorghum relative to the main competitive feed grain, and perhaps that would benefit someone, again, heading off into the harvest time frame.
Good observations for us once again, Dan. Thanks, and next Friday we'll talk again.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, Dan O'Brien, is a regular guest with us weekly here on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Coming your way now on this part of Agriculture Today, a glance to the canola planting season in Kansas. This oilseed crop has really gained a niche in crop production systems here in the state last several years. We welcome back by once again from the Department of Agronomy at K-State, canola breeder Mike Stamm. Mike, you are getting still more inquiries from even beginner canola growers about getting this crop off on the right foot, so the interest is out there.
Yeah, Eric, when I look at this year compared to other years that we've seeded the crop, I would say interest is steady on canola. We've had a really pretty strong price over this last production year and on into this year too, and so that's encouraging for producers, but we still have producers out there that are interested in cleaning up some wheat fields, and we really think that winter canola has that niche that you talked about.
It's proven to be a functional part of a rotation in many ways, actually.
Right. We don't think of it as a standalone crop. We certainly think about it in a system because it's not a crop we're going to be planting continuously. Mm-hmm. It's a crop we're going to be planting in rotation with wheat oftentimes. And we are right on the opening edge of the planting season in Kansas, aren't we? We are. We're getting into the crunch time, you could say. The middle of September is really the prime time to be planting winter canola in the state. And so, believe it or not, it's already here. It's going to be a little bit challenging, though, picking that optimum planting date this year with the soil moisture conditions that we see in a lot of parts of the state right now. Not unlike winter wheat, canola likes to start off in at least decently moist soil conditions, right? It's very important that we get canola off to a good start, and getting a good stand is really 80% of the process. Getting that good stand in the fall and over the winter really makes for the highest producing canola yields that we see. And so an even stand across the field is really critical. And when you think about it, canola is a crop that once it emerges from the soil, that growing point's always above the soil surface. And so we need an adequate amount of top growth in order for the crop to overwinter. And so delaying planting too late, you won't get that adequate top growth. Now, on the flip side of that, we can also plant too early sometimes, and we see excessive fall growth. And we've talked about this on the radio program previously about how having that excessive top growth can also lead to winter kills. So finding that optimum planting date is a little bit of a roll of the dice in years when we have dry soils like we do this year.
And how much wiggle room is there, though? Mid-September is the ideal, but how late can one go safely?
Well, safely, I would say September 30 is pretty well the cutoff for canola in Kansas. Now, we are limited a little bit by our insurance dates, and September 30 is that cutoff date for insurance, although there is a late planting period for those policies. However, we've seen the most consistent canola yields when we've planted before September 30. If we delay that planting into October, oftentimes we see less productive crops that are more prone to winter kill because they just don't get that fall growth that they need. Now, if you look back at last year, we had numerous fields, a lot of producers last year that planted the first week of October, and that was primarily because of replant issues. We had a lot of rain in the south central part of the state, and that washed out some stands, and so they were forced to plant in early October. And actually last year, that was the best performing canola in the state, that late planted canola.
That was an anomaly, though?
I would say it's highly unlikely that would occur every year where your latest planted canola is the best canola in the state, kind of the way it worked out. If you remember last year, we had nice moisture conditions early, and so producers were anxious to plant. They got in early, but then we had the open fall and the excessive top growth again. So getting that good stand and planted on time are the two really most important things.
You say, Mike, that of late you've been conducting some research here at K-State on variations of seeding rate.
So we're really interested in seeding rates right now in winter canola because we've seen such change in our production practices since we really started working with the crop. I'd say extensively, 15 years ago, looking at best establishment practices. And since those practices have changed dramatically and our varieties over that same time period have changed dramatically, we're looking at more precise seeding rates rather than just saying go out and seed 5 pounds to the acre like we previously did. There should be more precision with our seeding rates than just a blanket recommendation across production systems and across varieties. So what we're doing at K-State is looking at different seeding rates in different row spacings with different varieties. So it's a pretty complex study, but in the end, we want to know what should our optimal seeding rates be in our different row spacings that we can use, as well as do some of our varieties like the hybrids that are starting to be grown on more acres in the state, do they perform better at a lower seeding rate versus a higher seeding rate, or do our OPs perform better at a higher seeding rate versus a lower seeding rate? And so we've got all of these different questions that we're trying to address in these studies.
So for the here and now, for seeding rate this fall, you would stick with a standard?
Well, in our research the last couple of years, we've actually shown that if we do seed at that 5 pound per acre seeding rate, we're actually overseeding and causing more winter kill in the crop. We've shown that as you lower the seeding rate, actually winter survival increases, primarily because there's not as much competition in the field. And so canola is a crop that likes to compete, and it competes with itself in row. If it's got a real heavy population, there'll be some self-thinning and so forth going on. And so as you lower the seeding rate, winter survival increases. That always doesn't translate, though, into a benefit to yield. If you look at last year's seeding rate data, particularly in the 30-inch row spacing where we're investigating some of these seeding rates, we basically saw a straight line across our seeding rates in terms of yield. There was no benefit to a high seeding rate or a low seeding rate. It was just basically the year that we had. Now, if you look at our narrow row seeding rates, over the last 2 years, we kind of saw a bell curve where the lowest and the highest seeding rates had the lowest yields and the middle seeding rates had the highest yields. So we're talking about seeding rates in narrow rows from about 150,000 seeds per acre to 450,000 seeds per acre. So in our research over 2 years, 150,000 seeds per acre and 450,000 seeds per acre yielded about the same, but it was those middle seeding rates and around that 350,000 seeds per acre that actually excelled the best in terms of yield.
So if you need a number to shoot for, that would be it.
Yeah, I would say that around 3 to 4 pounds to the acre, depending on what your seed size is actually probably adequate now based on what our research is showing. And that somewhat holds true between both narrow and wide row spacings, but I think in the wide row spacings you could probably even lower that more, because when you think about it, if you widen your row spacing, you're increasing the competition in row again. And because you're putting more seeds in those rows when you're eliminating rows. And so if you can reduce that seeding rate in those wider row spacings, I think you'll see a benefit.
Mike, in view of the dry topsoil conditions out there, one is going to go ahead and plant and not wait out the weather and hope for a rain. Would you recommend adjusting the seeding depth to an extent?
With canola being a small seed size, we really shouldn't think about planting any deeper than, I would say, 1.5 inches. To me, 1 inch is adequate, but I do know some producers who have planted at 1.5 inches and been okay. I would still really like to see producers shoot for that inch planting depth. Now, think about it again in terms of that top growth. If you go out and seed in dry soil, that seed's going to sit there until you get a rain. So your effective establishment date is going to be later than what your actual planting date is. And, the longer it sits, the further it's delayed, and kind of rolling the dice again if the rains don't come. So we have seen in certain years where it just is too dry to plant canola. And so you want to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, to have kind of a plan B, so to speak, if you can't get in and get the canola seeded. My preference is to plant after a rain, if at all possible, rather than planting before a rain, because we do know with the small seed size we can also have some crusting issues, and if you plant it too deep and get that heavy rain, then you're in for some problems. But if adequate soil moisture is there in 1 inch, I really think that's the optimum seeding depth for this crop.
All right. Well, K-State, through your efforts and your associates, has amassed considerable information on canola production and succeeding with this oilseed crop in Kansas. There's likely much more that a grower would want to know about this, so they can access that information through their local extension office or online, can they not, Mike?
Yeah, the Great Plains Canola Production Handbook is a great resource, and we're in the process of updating it because, again, we have a wealth of knowledge that needs to be updated in that handbook, but it's still a really valuable resource for canola growers, and it goes from the very beginnings of establishment all the way to harvest, and so that's a great resource.
And that's online at the agronomy website as well as in printed form at local extension offices or through those facilities. Well, you'll likely be extraordinarily busy in the weeks ahead planting test plots and the like and embarking on another canola production season here in Kansas. So good luck with establishing those stands. And Mike, thank you for coming over.
Well, thanks for the invite.
Canola breeder, K-State's Department of Agronomy, that's Mike Stamm, with some quick considerations on getting that canola stand off on the right foot at planting time. And you're listening to Agriculture Today. We'll be back after this break with another update from the IGP Institute at K-State, what the crew there has been up to of late in promoting Kansas grain sales abroad. This week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop is also ahead with Marcia Boswell. And again, on Kansas agricultural weather, we'll hear from K-State's Mary Knapp. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and for you now, another update from the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University, which is in the midst, as we speak, of a special workshop being conducted here for those interested in marketing grain via the container market option. And we'll explain further as Jay O'Neill has joined us once again, the senior economist with the IGP Institute. This is sponsored by the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission, you say, Jay, and it's a potential alternative to marketing that you're presenting to producers and others, correct?
Correct. This is sponsored by the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission with the intent of helping producers, grain elevators, small originators, if you will, understand the possibilities and the ins and outs of loading containers to ship to customers overseas who might want smaller volumes, 1,000 tons, 2,000 tons of be it sorghum or other specialized commodities, as opposed to a full ship of 50 or 60,000 tons.
This would allow producers who would be so involved to gain some sort of economic advantage, perhaps, by marketing their grain via container?
Yes, there are buyers around the world, whether it be for food-grade purposes or other specialty needs, or just by economy of size, who say, I'm too small to take 50 or 60,000 tons, but boy, I'd sure like to buy 1,000, 2,000 tons of sorghum, be it specialty sorghum for making alcohol in China or sorghum for food purposes, or just, again, a mill who says, I don't need a big quantity. Can I go direct to a country elevator, a country shipper, a producer, and possibly buy some of this grain and ship it in a smaller increment that would suit both of our purposes?
The mechanics here briefly. Containers would be brought to a delivery point, presumably via rail, loaded, and then shipped to the port for transport on a sailing vessel?
Exactly. The containers in this case would be coming into Kansas City area, Edgerton, to the BNSF Center Point container ramp. The possibility would be to grab some of those containers and load them with grain and get them back to the ramp within 2 or 3 days, and take advantage of those containers that are coming and going from the Kansas City area. The only catch in that is it greatly helps economically to be within about a 50-mile radius of that BNSF ramp.
So, who's here for the workshop taking the information in, and what are you conveying to them?
There's been 2 workshops. Yesterday, we drove out to Garden City, Kansas, and we did a workshop for the participants in western Kansas, and we had about 17, 18, I think, participants out there that were grain elevators from western Kansas, and the number of sorghum producers that were out there, as well as a few other individuals. So we did one yesterday. Today we have individuals from Kansas City area and locally who are working with the interest in what can we do from Kansas City. Freight forwarders, shipping. One gentleman here who has a buyer in Japan who wants to buy some grain, and he wants to know how he might be able to facilitate that through containers because it's going to be a specialty product. So we have those type of participants here from the eastern Kansas region.
Your purpose is to familiarize those taking in the program to the concept itself and how they might capitalize on it.
Absolutely. We're here to let them know here's how containers are loaded, here's how you would get access to the containers, here's the process you'd have to use to load them, here's the coopering material, how you have to close up the back of a container once you load it, how much weight you're allowed to put in a container, a 20-foot or a 40-foot, and then how you would dray it, which is truck it, to and from the container port to serve the needs of your customer.
So generally, Jay, in these 2 sessions, what's been the response, and how do you assess the true level of interest?
Well, the level of interest is high. The level of interest has been very, very good, and it's been interesting to talk to these folks about the possibility. Now, from the standpoint of those folks in Garden City in western Kansas, the reaction is it's regrettable that we're so darn far west because we're hundreds of miles away from the ramp, and that makes the drayage cost very, very expensive, as much as $70, $71 a ton, or about $1.80 a bushel to dray containers from western Kansas all the way to Kansas City, and that makes it pretty darn expensive. Eastern Kansas, the attitude is, yes, we can dray things much cheaper because we're closer to Kansas City, and there may be certainly more possibilities the farther east you go than being as far west as some folks are.
So it, again, is all about logistics, but in closing here, this is a market outlet that could be ripe for the picking, at least in eastern Kansas.
I think so, yes. I think that it does provide opportunities, whether you sell your grain to a company that's already doing this business in the Kansas City area, or whether you try to initiate something on your own in eastern Kansas. Those possibilities exist.
Well, it's an interesting and different angle on the information provided by the IGP Institute. In this case, sponsored by the Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission, a container loading workshop as once more a potential marketing option. Jay, thanks for summarizing what's been going on here in Manhattan and in Garden City earlier this week. Appreciate your time as always.
You're very welcome.
He's Jay O'Neill, senior economist with the IGP Institute staff here at Kansas State University, with our regular IGP update on agriculture today. Now this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop comes your way with Marcia Boswell. Marcia?
The smell of animal barns and the quiet sizzle of frying foods fill the air. The hard work of 4-H'ers, FFA students, and open class participants lines the walls of buildings. The subtle roar of carnival barkers and the muffled screams from Ye Old Mill welcome you back to the dusty, Kansas-themed streets of the Kansas State Fair. Kansas Wheat will once again host a tribute to the wheat industry in the Pride of Kansas building during the entirety of the fair. This year we will be celebrating the National Festival of Breads. The festival is sponsored biennially by the Kansas Wheat Commission, King Arthur Flour, and Red Star Yeast. More than 3,000 people from at least 46 states and 4 countries attended the event that showcases Kansas wheat and the farmers that grow it. Cindy Falk, National Festival of Bread's co-chairperson and nutrition educator for Kansas Wheat, says the National Festival of Breads builds upon a rich tradition of grassroots support and is the nation's only amateur yeast bread baking competition. The 2017 Kansas Wheat Recipe Book is hot off the presses, making its debut at the Kansas State Fair booth. The annual recipe book features National Festival of Bread's finalist recipes developed by home bakers all over the country, and include the 2017 National Festival of Bread's champion, Ronna Farley's seeded corn and onion bubble loaf. Kansans Jane Fry of Elk Falls and Michael Favor of Madison are featured in the book with their respective recipes, Southwest Focaccia and French Vanilla Donuts. The Kansas State Fair runs September 8th through the 17th. Be sure to visit the Kansas Wheat booth in the Pride of Kansas building and learn more about the impact of the wheat state. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. And this is Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Next up on Agriculture Today, Kansas agricultural weather. And once again with us is Mary Knapp, Research and Extension Climatologist at K-State, over from the Weather Data Library here on the campus. A very simple recap here, Mary. It was a dry and cool week all throughout Kansas.
That was basically it. We did have a little bit of moisture in there, mostly in the southern division, southwest, south central, and a little bit into the central area. Saw some moisture at least, but only the south central was anywhere above 50%. They were at 59% of normal. They averaged about 36/100ths of an inch, which was very welcome in that area, but by no means everything that we need to get the soil profile filled for our upcoming fall planted crops. Most of the areas averaged less than 1/10 of an inch, and statewide, the average was only 9/100ths of an inch. So again, a very dry week. Welcome if you were trying to get hay put up or if you were trying to get some of the corn harvested. Not so welcome if you've still got beans or sorghum that you're trying to finish up, because this dry weather has reduced the condition of the bean crop quite substantially. The other point with that is that it could have been worse if the temperatures had been warmer. We did get some warm readings out in the western divisions, particularly in that northwest corner. They had temperatures get up to 100 degrees. But that's also the area where we saw some of our coldest readings. It's very dry air mass coming through with this latest cold front, which allowed temperatures to drop fairly significantly.
And in fact, we had one single frost reading, you say.
Right. Brewster up in Thomas County actually reported a 32-degree reading for their low on the 6th. So that was our frost point. But we saw temperatures down into the 30s in west central Kansas, and every division in the state had temperatures drop below 50. And again, for those that have sorghum in production, that 50-degree threshold is bad news for that crop trying to finish off.
That crop is grinding to a halt in many locations around Kansas. Since we've had this extended dryness, the drought monitor has not worsened terribly, but do we see that changing?
It's likely that, given the fact that the outlook calls for another dry week, that we will probably see some severe drought begin to creep in. Candidates for that will be in the central part of the state, where they've had several months now of drier than normal conditions. And also there's a patch up in north central Kansas, basically on the border between northeast and north central, Nemaha and Marshall County, where they've managed to miss all of the rains, and they're beginning to see some severe drought conditions develop. Most of this is on the crop side of things. The pond levels are falling, but are still not super low, and the stream flows are still fairly good. But again, for any of the crop production and for some of the pastures, this has not been a good summer.
Once more, there was no residual moisture relief from hurricane, then tropical storm Harvey, and this latest hurricane to hit Florida likely won't even come within whiffing distance of this area in terms of drift moisture. But those systems are kind of keeping the weather at a standstill in the Central Plains, aren't they?
Well, basically, one of the factors with those, the paths of those storms is where the ridges have set up. And there is still that ridge to the west that has been fueling above normal temperatures there with all of the attendant fire danger and dry conditions. And that doesn't show signs of eroding very quickly. When we look at the quantitative precip forecast, it's interesting to note that there does seem to be some residual monsoon moisture that's going to make its way up through the Rockies and into eastern Colorado. And that's where northwest Kansas has the best chance of seeing moisture next week from that particular pattern. If we can see that ridge erode a little bit, then there's a little bit better chance that we will see some moisture as we get into the 8 to 14 day period. The September outlook is still for drier than normal conditions for most of the state. And given the fact that we preloaded with a dry week, it's not surprising that that holds true. When we look at the 3-month outlook, it is neutral with a slight chance for wetter than normal conditions in our south. So we'll see how that goes. They're also calling for warmer than normal temperatures for the 3-month outlook. We may see an extended pattern similar to what we've got currently.
But on the other end of the temperature spectrum, will we be attempting freezing temperatures again anytime soon?
At this point, they're not calling for anything soon, but one of the problems with having such a dry air mass in place, which we have right now, as indicated by these nighttime lows dropping down into the 40s and 50s, the dew points are very low. That means that a front coming through from the Canadian provinces is not going to moderate as quickly, and that gives us a chance for a very quick cold front coming through and bringing freezing temperatures. And those kinds of patterns are very hard to predict in advance as to exactly when that might happen. But with the dry pattern in place, the chance for that early freeze goes up.
And, of course, everybody's attention again on that string of hurricanes. There's another one following Irma. We're really not anticipating any kind of influence on our weather whatsoever from these, are we?
No, we're not. And the one that we might watch more than Irma and Jose, which are both in the Atlantic and expected to curve up along the East Coast, is there's one setting up in the Bay of Campeche in Mexico. And that's expected to cross westward into Mexico, and then the moisture feed up the mountains in that area. That might actually send more moisture our way than either of the Atlantic systems.
But
that's a long way out, and that's a long way for that moisture to make it to get to us. And again, more likely that it'll continue along the spine of the mountains and bring moisture into the desert Southwest or into the mountains and not really make it out into the plains.
For the most part, seasonal temperatures and further dryness for the foreseeable future. That's the story. And Mary, thank you for coming over as always. Enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Eric.
Along with us each Friday is research and extension climatologist here at K-State, Mary Knapp, with the latest on Kansas agricultural weather for us. And that's our time for today and for the week. Thanks to you for being along with us, and do enjoy your weekend likewise. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.